This week we're focusing on international responses to climate-related security challenges. Before I really get into that, and we are going to talk about the growing number of both domestic and international responses, I wanted to kind of remind all of us where we have come from last week and defining the terms that we'll use both last week and this week: mitigation, adaptation, risk, and vulnerability. Mitigation are efforts to reduce or prevent an undesirable outcome. Adaptation are adjustments to potential damages or benefits that are going to happen and that you are not trying to prevent. You're just trying to adapt to that new reality. Risk is a function of the potential impact of the event or the likelihood of it occurring. Connecting back to week 2 in the Collier and Hoffler article, the cost-benefit analysis of people joining civil wars, the probability of victory, the risk of losing, which is another way of looking at that, definitely shapes the payoffs for either joining or staying out of a conflict. And then vulnerability is how much a group, a state, an individual is exposed to a change, and how much the country or individual has a capacity to be able to adapt to that change. So I mentioned in the last video the international responses as a function of arguable difficulty, connecting it to political science, international relations literature on the decision-making of larger groups being more difficult than smaller groups, connecting it to Mansur Olson's work and others, Tragedy of the Commons, going back to also the Cold War in the 60s with Elinor Ostrom's work on the Tragedy of the Commons, in which everyone has an incentive to try to benefit from common resources without trying to pay the cost for the long-term sustainability of those resources. If you have a medieval town square and grass grows on it and we all have cows, we have incentive to make sure that our cows are fed, and we are all potentially worse off by not protecting the resource for long-term sustainability, making sure there's enough grass to go around, we don't overgraze at any particular time. The tragedy of the commons is often our individual incentives for survival or benefit can cause us long-term harm because everyone's operating in their own self-interest. A couple of other issues: the larger number of veto players, the harder it can be to reach any kind of agreement, as well as those number of actors that goes into making the decision. Veto players are those that can prevent something from happening, like with the Security Council in the United Nations. There's the main permanent 5 members that have veto power with any of these international organizations. Some have decision-making that's based on unanimity. All states have to agree. In others, it can be a simple majority. Others, your votes can be weighted by how much money you give to the organization. What's really important to understand is who those veto players are, how the structure of that cooperative effort is set up to understand the likelihood of things being passed or actual action arising from those commitments. And the last point, especially now in Australia after the election of the weekend, the changing distribution of power and capabilities, international politics and economics can also shape how difficult it can be to have long-term commitments to a lot of the international agreements that we're going to be talking about today. I think, of course, to the Paris Climate Change Accords that the Obama administration committed to, and then after the Trump administration came into office, they withdrew from it. There can be a seesawing depending on who's in power in different countries to make it difficult for commitments to be seen as plausible, regardless of who holds power in different countries. Okay. Domestic challenges to cooperation. I talked about international ones domestically. I can think of a couple of domestic incentives that I think are important to try to understand potentially why some of these efforts haven't taken off or haven't had more of a difference. So the Kyoto Protocol we've talked about a bit earlier, the Rio summit before that, and Paris after that. There can be difficulties in holding states to account for not meeting their emissions commitments. Now, Kyoto is what, 25, 26 years ago now. A lot of the commitments that the major actors made there weren't actually carried through. See last week's discussion of the Australian government's policies to, and the US as well, to either abide by or not abide by their commitments made at Kyoto. Either cheating of these organizations with pollution, or bribes like we talked about in previous weeks, or OPEC with trying to limit the amount of oil that's pumped. There is incentives for states to produce more because they stand to benefit more, as long as everyone else doesn't act as quickly as you do, because if the whole market gets flooded by everybody, then the price goes down. But if everyone else is limiting their production and then you can spike it up, you can benefit disproportionately. You could think of similar factors related to water, or with other international resources, in which one actor could overdraw and the others might not realize it until after they've received a benefit. And then International Criminal Court, there is a challenge that for domestic reasons, states or other actors might withdraw from their commitments, because, like with South Africa and Burundi withdrew because there was talk of holding the previous president account for human rights violations within the country. South Africa withdrew because they faced international pressure to arrest the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, when he visited at a conference in South Africa. So the South African High Court said that you needed to arrest them, but the executive branch has norms of reciprocity and wouldn't want a similar thing to happen to them if they traveled abroad. So they resisted that arrest warrant. But these domestic challenges could lead to more difficult international cooperative efforts. And this kind of leads me to the big challenge that we've talked about in a number of different weeks this semester, as well as for a number of your final papers related to climate change cooperation and trying to mitigate the effects that we've spent the middle part of the class focusing on. And let's turn to the IPCC now, and try to understand what it's made of. And then we focused this week on a chapter from the 2014 report. I was going to assign a chapter from the 2022 report, but I found it less easily extracted and less directly connected to the issues that we've talked about in this class. So let's go ahead and turn to the IPCC now.